Early on, a gray morning near the Capitol, a police officer pressed a tall, lean black man in a running jacket against an iron fence and pulled his arms behind his back. A paper cup of coffee lay tipped on the sidewalk, its contents bleeding across the concrete. A few early tourists had stopped, and phones were rising. Officer Tyler Hoffman felt the clean certainty of a man who had cleared a vagrant off a street that mattered. What Hoffman did not know, what he had refused to check even once, was that the silver-haired man he was handcuffing for loitering was a sitting United States senator walking to his own office 2 blocks away, and that the committee this man sat on helped decide how much federal money Hoffman's department received every single year. Before we find out who the man in the handcuffs really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a quiet morning walk nearly became a national scandal, you have to rewind about 10 minutes to the moment Senator Elias Warner left his townhouse on foot. Elias Warner was 58 years old, and he did not look that morning like one of the 100 most powerful legislators in the country. He was tall and lean, almost lanky, with the light, easy frame of a lifelong distance runner and the slightly stooped shoulders of a man who spent his days bent over briefing books. His hair was cut close and had gone nearly white at the temples. He was clean-shaven, with a long, thoughtful face, warm, deep-set eyes behind thin, wire-rimmed glasses, and a small gap in his front teeth that showed when he smiled, which was often. He wore a plain navy running jacket, athletic pants, and worn trainers, and he carried a paper cup of coffee in one hand and nothing else. No briefcase, no aid, no security. Because Senator Elias Warner had a habit that his staff had long ago given up trying to break him of. On mornings when the Senate wasn't in an early session, he walked to work, alone. 2 blocks from his townhouse to his office near the Capitol, the same walk he'd taken since his first term. Because he said the day he needed a motorcade to go 2 blocks was the day he'd forgotten where he came from. He had come from very little, the son of a school custodian, the first in his family to finish college, and after 2 terms in the Senate and a seat on the Appropriations Committee, the one thing he guarded most fiercely was the ordinary. The walk was ordinary. The coffee was ordinary. Being a man on a sidewalk in the early morning was ordinary, and he loved it. His days, once he reached the office, were anything but. He chaired subcommittee hearings and negotiated line items and bills that ran to thousands of pages. He fought over funding for schools and hospitals and, yes, law enforcement, the unglamorous machinery of deciding where a government's money actually went. He had a reputation across the aisle as a man who did his homework, who could not be bluffed on a number, and who was unfailingly courteous right up until the moment he took a witness apart with a quiet question. Almost none of that was visible in the lanky man in the running jacket drinking coffee on the sidewalk. That was rather the point. He had spent a career being underestimated at first glance and had learned to find it useful. He had simply never expected the first glance to end in handcuffs. On his lapel, half hidden by the collar of his running jacket, was a small pin. The discreet gold and enamel pin worn by members of the United States Senate, the one that told any Capitol police officer in the district exactly who he was at a glance. He'd clipped it on out of pure habit the way he did every morning. It was a small thing, that pin, but in the district around the Capitol, it was practically a passport. Every officer who worked those blocks was trained to recognize it, because the last thing any department wanted was one of its patrolmen hassling a member of Congress. It sat there on his lapel, catching what little light the gray morning offered, an unmistakable signal of exactly who he was, requiring nothing of anyone but a glance. Warner never thought about it. It was as automatic as his keys or his watch. He could not have imagined, clipping it on in his front hallway that morning, that within 15 minutes an officer would stand close enough to read it, with the man's very identity glinting an inch from his hand, and would still manage not to see it, because seeing it would have meant seeing the man, and the officer had already decided not to. He had no idea that the pin, the walk, and the ordinary morning were about to collide with a patrol officer who looked at a black man in a running jacket near the Capitol and saw someone who did not belong. Officer Tyler Hoffman was 30 years old, and he was built like the high school wrestler he'd once been, short, thick through the neck and shoulders, with close-cropped ginger hair, a spray of freckles across a sunburned face, and small, pale eyes that missed most things and were certain about all of them. He'd worked the district around the Capitol for 2 years, and he'd developed the particular self-importance of an officer who patrols near power. He believed that guarding the neighborhood of the powerful made him, in some small way, powerful too, and he policed its sidewalks accordingly. He kept a running mental map of who belonged on his beat, the staffers in their lanyards, the lobbyists in their good suits, the tourists in their groups, and a matching map of who didn't. In 2 years, he'd made a lot of stops on that second map, and almost all of them had gone nowhere and left the person shaken and unable to do a thing about it. That was the quiet engine of a habit like his. It cost him nothing when he was wrong, which was nearly always because the people he was wrong about had no way to make him feel it. He had come to mistake the absence of consequences for the presence of good instincts. This morning, for the first time, the man on the wrong end of his certainty could make him feel it. He rolled past the iron fence at the edge of a small park and saw a tall black man in a running jacket standing on the sidewalk, sipping coffee, looking up at the dome in the distance. Hoffman did not think, early jogger, resident, maybe a staffer getting a coffee before work. He did not think, that's a lapel pin. That's a member of Congress. In the half-second, his eyes landed on Elias Warner. He had already written the story, and the story was that the man didn't belong. A black man in athletic clothes, alone, loitering near federal buildings at an odd hour, no briefcase, no badge visible, just standing there. To Hoffman, that read as a vagrant, or a protester casing a spot, or a suspicious person who needed to be moved along before the important people arrived. Every piece of that judgment came from the man's skin and Hoffman's certainty about who belonged on those particular sidewalks, and not one piece came from a fact. He didn't run anything. He didn't notice the pin. He pulled his cruiser to the curb, stepped out, and walked up on the senator with his thumbs in his belt and his chin already lowered. "Morning," Hoffman said, in a tone that made it not a greeting. "What are you doing out here? You've been standing around." Elias Warner turned and gave the officer the easy gap-toothed smile he gave everyone. "Good morning, officer. Just having my coffee before work. I'm headed to my office. It's right up the block." He lifted the cup slightly, a small, friendly gesture. "Long as I've been doing this walk, the coffee's the only part I never skip." "Your office?" Hoffman repeated flatly, his eyes moving over the running jacket and the trainers with open skepticism. "Where do you work?" "Just up the street," Warner said, still pleasant, though a familiar weariness had begun quietly behind his eyes. "I can show you my identification if you'd like. It's in my jacket. I'll reach for it slowly." "Yeah, do that," Hoffman said, "because from where I'm standing, you look like you've got no business here." And that was the moment Senator Elias Warner understood exactly what kind of morning this was going to be, and the moment Officer Tyler Hoffman started down a road he could not come back from. Now, here is what Officer Hoffman could not have known as he stood there deciding a man had no business on a public sidewalk, and what that man had just offered, plainly to prove. The person Hoffman had decided was a loitering vagrant was Senator Elias Warner, a 2-term United States Senator, and a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, one of the small handful of people in the entire country with direct authority over the federal budget. Among the many things that committee funded were the grants and programs that flowed down to state and local law enforcement agencies, including, quite specifically, the department whose uniform Tyler Hoffman was wearing. In the plainest possible terms, the man in the running jacket helped decide how much money Hoffman's department got every year. He was, in the machinery of the federal government, about as far above a patrol officer as it was possible to be. It is worth understanding how literal that was. Appropriations is the committee that decides how federal money is spent, and a meaningful share of local policing runs on federal grants. Equipment, task forces, training, overtime. When a department applies for those dollars, the money moves through a process that Warner and his colleagues shape and approve. He would not, of course, ever reach down and touch one patrol officer's paycheck. That is not how it works. But in the aggregate, in the only way that actually matters, the resources that put Tyler Hoffman in a cruiser on that beat existed downstream of decisions made by the committee the handcuffed man sat on. Hoffman had, without the faintest idea, put steel on the wrists of the budget itself. And it was almost absurd how easily it could have been avoided. The lapel pin, half hidden by his collar, would have told any Capitol Police officer exactly who he was. The identification in his jacket would have ended it in 10 seconds. A single question to anyone, a call, a radio check, a glance at the pin, would have collapsed the whole misunderstanding before it began. Every off-ramp was right there. That is the quiet, almost comic gravity of what you're watching. A patrol officer had chosen, out of nothing but the sight of a black man in a running jacket, to detain the single worst person in Washington to be wrong about, a sitting senator who literally helped write the checks that funded his department, and he was about to do it on his own body camera on a public sidewalk 2 blocks from the Capitol, with tourists already lifting their phones. If you already know this is going to be a catastrophe for this officer, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the moment his mistake meets who this man actually is coming, and it is going to be remarkable. There was another reason the morning landed as hard as it did, and it had a name: Xavier Bell. Xavier was 23, a bright young black man who worked as a legislative intern in Warner's own office, and just the week before, walking that very same block to work, he had been stopped by this same Officer Hoffman and asked, in that same skeptical tone, whether he actually worked around here. Xavier had shown his congressional staff badge, watched Hoffman study it with visible disappointment, and been sent on his way without an apology. He'd told no one who could do anything about it. He'd just swallowed it, the way he'd learned to. It had happened fast and quietly, the way it always did. Hoffman had rolled up beside him, asked where he was going, asked if he actually worked around here, in a tone that made the answer feel like a lie before Xavier gave it. Xavier had produced his congressional staff badge, watched the officer study it with a flicker of disappointment, and been waved on without a word of apology. He had walked the rest of the way to the office with his face hot and his hands not quite steady, and he'd told no one, because he was 23 and new and certain that a complaint from an intern about a police officer would land on him, not on the officer. So he'd folded it down and carried it into work and answered his phones and said nothing, and told himself that was just the cost of the walk. That morning, Xavier happened to be walking to the office a little early, coming up the far side of the street, when he saw the flashing lights in the small crowd, and then, with a lurch in his stomach, recognized both men. The officer who'd stopped him and the senator he worked for, pressed against a fence. He fumbled his phone out with shaking hands and started to record, because he understood, all at once, that this time there needed to be proof. And across the street, a security camera on the corner of a federal building watched the whole thing, recording steadily as more and more tourists stopped and raised their phones. Warner reached slowly toward the inside of his running jacket. "My ID's right here," he said. "I'm going to take it out now." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Hoffman barked, his palm dropping to his belt. And when Warner froze and slowly raised both hands, coffee cup and all, the officer read the pause not as compliance but as defiance. "I told you to show me ID and now you're reaching around? Turn around, hands behind your back." "Officer," Warner said. And the pleasantness was gone now, replaced by a low, steady seriousness. "I have offered you my identification 3 times. I have told you I work up the street. There is a pin on my lapel that tells you exactly who I am if you'll look at it. You do not have a lawful basis to detain me. I'd ask you to stop and think before you do this." "Turn around," Hoffman repeated. Elias Warner had spent 58 years as a black man in America, and 30 of them in and around the halls of power, and he knew, with a weary, bone-deep certainty, that the sidewalk was not where this got won. Arguing with a keyed-up officer, hands moving, voice rising, was how a bad stop became a tragedy. So he made the choice that kept everyone safe and put the truth on the record. He complied, and he narrated. It was a choreography he'd learned as a boy and never once been able to retire, no matter how far he rose. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Announce everything before you do it. Don't reach fast. Don't argue loud. Don't match their volume. Don't give a frightened man in a uniform a single thing he can turn into a reason. He had performed it as a teenager stopped walking home, and he performed it now as a United States Senator on the Appropriations Committee. And the fact that 2 Senate terms and a seat writing the nation's laws had not earned him the right to skip. It was its own quiet verdict on the country he had given his life to. He did it flawlessly, the way he always did. And as always, doing everything right was not going to be enough to stop a man who decided the rules didn't apply to someone who looked like him. "I am not resisting," he said clearly, turning toward the fence and letting the officer take his arms. "For the record, my name is Elias Warner. I am a United States Senator. I offered my identification repeatedly. I am being detained on a public sidewalk while walking to my own office, and every second of this is being recorded." The coffee cup slipped from his fingers as Hoffman pulled his wrists back, and it hit the sidewalk and burst, a brown stain spreading across the concrete. The cuffs ratcheted shut, tight, over the wrists of a sitting senator. There is a particular indignity to being handcuffed that has nothing to do with the pain of the steel, and Warner felt it the way he'd felt it once as a young man and had hoped, foolishly, never to feel again. The sudden reduction of a whole life to a body a stranger could arrange. He had testified before presidents. He had negotiated bills that changed millions of lives. And on a gray sidewalk 2 blocks from the Capitol, none of it existed. There was only a man in a uniform who had decided what he was, and a set of cuffs that made the decision physical. He kept his face still and his voice level because he had learned long ago that composure was the only power they couldn't take on a sidewalk. But he felt it. He always felt it. Hoffman pressed him against the cold iron fence. "You're detained for loitering and failure to comply," Hoffman announced to his own body camera, patting the man down. In the breast pocket of the running jacket, his fingers found a slim leather case. He pulled it halfway out, saw what looked like a card, and, certain it was some fake or some hustle, shoved it back without reading it and kept going. He never looked at the pin, glinting now, in plain view on the lapel, an inch from his own hand. Warner turned his cheek toward the fence, kept his voice level, and spoke to the camera on Hoffman's chest with the calm precision of a man who had cross-examined witnesses in committee for 2 decades. "You have just handcuffed a United States Senator for walking to work," he said. "My identification is in my jacket, where you refuse to read it. My Senate pin is on my lapel, where you refuse to look at it. In a few minutes, someone is going to recognize me, and you are going to wish very much that you had simply looked. I gave you every chance. You took none of them. If you already know someone is about to recognize this man, hit like and subscribe, because the moment they do changes everything." The recognition came from a woman crossing the street at a near run. Officer Maria Reyes was a 15-year veteran of the United States Capitol Police, and her entire job was to know the faces of the members of Congress on sight. She had been posted near the Capitol for years. She had stood in hallways and at doors and in committee rooms, and she knew Senator Elias Warner the way she knew 100 members, by face, by name, by the gap-toothed smile he gave every officer who held a door for him. She had been walking her own morning route when she saw the flashing lights and the small crowd, and a tall man in a running jacket bent against a fence, and her stomach had dropped before her mind had even caught up. "Hey, hey!" she called, cutting through the tourists. "What is going on here?" She reached them, took one look at the man's face, and went pale. "Oh my God! Officer, do you know who this is? This is Senator Warner. This is Senator Elias Warner. He's a United States Senator. Hoffman's certainty cracked for the first time. Ma'am, stay back. This guy was. That is a United States Senator, and you have him in handcuffs, Reyes said, her voice climbing. I see him 3 times a week. I have held doors for this man. Get those cuffs off him. Get them off him right now. At that moment, a marked supervisor's car pulled up hard behind Hoffman's cruiser, and a local sergeant climbed out. A graying man named Sergeant Nolan, who had heard one of his young officers call in a loitering detention 2 blocks from the Capitol and had felt instantly the specific dread of a veteran who knows that nothing good happens on those particular sidewalks. He walked up, saw the Capitol officer's face, saw the man against the fence, and understood in a single sick beat exactly how bad it was. Tell me his name, Nolan said quietly to Reyes. Senator Elias Warner. Appropriations. I'd stake my career on it. Nolan closed his eyes for a second. Then he was moving. Get the cuffs off him. Hoffman, step back and do not say another word. Hoffman fumbled his key out, his freckled face gone blotchy and pale at once, and the steel came off the senator's wrists, leaving raw red bands. On the sidewalk, when the cuffs came off and the tall man in the running jacket straightened up and calmly drew his own Senate ID from his pocket, a low sound moved through the gathered tourists. Not quite a gasp, more a collective recognition, the sound of a crowd realizing all at once that the thing they had been filming was even worse than it looked. Someone said, clearly, "That's a senator? That's actually a senator." And the murmur rippled outward, and the phone stayed up, because now they were recording the correction as carefully as they had recorded the crime. Neither Reyes nor Nolan tried to move anyone along. The veterans understood what the young officer never had. The cameras were not the enemy. They were the only reason the truth had a chance. Warner brought his arms forward slowly and rolled his shoulders and did not rub his wrists and did not raise his voice. He reached into his own jacket, drew out the slim leather case Hoffman had refused to read, and let it fall open. A United States Senate identification card, his photograph, his name, his title. Then he touched the small gold and enamel pin on his lapel, the one that had been in plain view the entire time. This, he said quietly, to no one and everyone, is what he wouldn't look at. And right then, as if the morning meant to underline the point, the phone in his jacket pocket began to buzz. He answered it one-handed, his eyes never leaving the officers. It was his chief of staff, calling to ask where he was, because a committee vote had been moved up, and the ranking member was asking for him. Warner listened, then said evenly into the phone, "I'm going to be a few minutes late, Diane. I've been placed in handcuffs on the sidewalk. No, I'm fine. Send someone with the office's counsel and tell them to bring the incident preserved." The 2 officers listening to his half of that call felt the ground shift further under them with every calm, matter-of-fact word. There was something almost surreal about it for Hoffman, to stand there and listen to the man he'd just called a loiterer casually reschedule a committee vote, name-drop a ranking member as an afterthought, direct that the office's counsel be dispatched to the scene, all in the unbothered tone of a person for whom this was simply Tuesday's inconvenience rather than the defining catastrophe of someone's life. Every word was another confirmation of exactly how wrong he'd been, delivered not as an accusation, but as ordinary business, which was somehow worse. Hoffman had wanted 10 minutes earlier to feel important on the sidewalks of the powerful. He was now getting the most complete education imaginable in what actual power sounded like, and it sounded like a tired man on the phone being gracious about being handcuffed. Warner ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He did not gloat. He straightened his running jacket, picked up nothing, the coffee was a loss on the concrete, and turned to Sergeant Nolan with the composed authority of a man who ran hearings for a living. "Sergeant, I want a few things on the record, and I want them now," he said. "A preservation order on this officer's body camera and dash camera, effective immediately, nothing overwritten. The security footage from that federal building across the street. The dispatch audio. and statements from the witnesses on this sidewalk, including the young man across the street with his phone up, who happens to work in my office. His eyes moved to Xavier Bell, still standing frozen at the curb, and softened for just a moment. I want an accurate record of exactly what happened here. It's already being flagged, Senator, Nolan said, his voice hoarse. Then Warner turned to Officer Tyler Hoffman, and when he spoke to him, there was no heat in it at all, which made it far worse than shouting. Officer Hoffman, I told you what I was 3 times, and I offered you my identification 3 times, and there was a pin on my lapel an inch from your hand the whole time, Warner said. You refused to look at any of it because you had already decided that a black man in a running jacket could not possibly belong on this sidewalk. Now, I want you to understand the shape of the mistake you made this morning because it is instructive. He paused. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. Among the many things that committee funds are the federal grants that flow to state and local police departments, including yours. In the most literal sense, officer, I help decide how much money your department receives every year. You did not just handcuff a stranger this morning. You handcuffed one of the people who signs the checks that pay for your patrol car because you couldn't imagine he'd earned the right to walk to work. Hoffman said nothing. There was nothing to say that the PIN, the ID, the Capitol officer, and his own camera had not already said. And here is the part that matters more than my morning, Warner went on, quieter still. Last week you stopped a young man on this same block and asked him if he actually worked around here. His name is Xavier Bell. He works for me. He's twice the public servant you are, and he came in that day and said nothing because he didn't think anyone would care. You have a habit, officer. This once, found someone it couldn't be buried on. Across the street, Xavier Bell lowered his phone, and something in his chest, a thing he'd been carrying for a week and for years before that, shifted. He had spent that week telling himself his own stop hadn't really mattered, that it was small, that making noise about it would only cost him. And now he'd watch the same officer do a far worse version of the same thing to a United States senator. And he'd watch that senator refuse to let it be small, refuse to swallow it, say Xavier's own name into a body camera as if a nobody intern's Tuesday morning humiliation was evidence worth entering into the permanent record. In that moment, Xavier understood something that would reshape the rest of his life, that the swallowing was never required. That silence had felt like safety only because no one had ever shown him what the alternative could look like. Now, someone had. Officer Tyler Hoffman stood by the iron fence in a kind of paralysis, the reality arriving in waves. He had handcuffed a United States senator, on camera, on a public sidewalk, 2 blocks from the Capitol, in front of a crowd, for the crime of walking to work. The self-importance that had powered him out of his cruiser had drained away entirely, leaving a freckled young man who looked suddenly like he might be sick. And all of it was recorded. The tourists on the sidewalk had captured it from a dozen angles. The federal building's camera had it. Xavier Bell had it. Officer Reyes's own body camera was running. By the time the sun was fully up, the first clips were already climbing, and they would need no caption at all. A sitting United States senator, handcuffed against a fence in his running clothes because a patrol officer couldn't imagine a black man in athletic wear near the Capitol was anyone who mattered. The footage was the kind that did not simply spread, it detonated. By the time the morning shows came on, it was the lead. Cable panels dissected it frame by frame. Colleagues from both parties, some sincere, some performing, issued statements. Reporters staked out the department, and through all of it ran the same shaky vertical clip. A silver-haired man in a navy running jacket, calm as still water, saying I am a United States senator while a freckled young officer pushed him against an iron fence. It was, people kept saying, unbelievable. And yet the thing that made it land so hard was that for millions of viewers, it was entirely, exhaustingly believable. They had simply never before seen it happen to someone the cameras couldn't be turned off around. Because this was not an ordinary bad stop, and it was never going to be handled like one. When you handcuff a senator, the The machinery that responds is not a precinct complaint desk. It is the press, and it is Congress, and it is every camera in a city built on them. By midday, the story was national. By evening, it had a name and a face and a shaky vertical video of a silver-haired man in a running jacket saying, calmly, "I am a United States Senator," while an officer pushed him against a fence. Warner himself said very little at first, and what he did say was measured in a way that surprised the people expecting fury. He did not go on every program that begged for him. He gave one short statement, standing at a plain podium, and the thing he chose to emphasize was not his own indignity. "I'm all right," he said. "I had every advantage a person can have in that situation, and I still ended up in handcuffs on a public sidewalk. What I want you to think about is not what happened to a senator. It's what happens every day to the people who don't have a pin on their lapel and 100 cameras watching, the people this happens to who then have to go to work and say nothing because no one would believe them." It was, aides noted, the same thing he'd said quietly to the officer on the sidewalk, and the same thing he would say, at greater length and under oath, to a room full of police chiefs weeks later. He was nothing if not consistent about where he pointed the attention, always away from himself and toward the people the cameras never found. The internal investigation moved with a speed that internal investigations almost never manage, because the entire country was watching, and the department had nowhere to hide. And it did not take long, because the evidence came from every direction and pointed one way. Hoffman did the thing officers in his position always try. He wrote a report describing a suspicious individual who had been loitering near federal facilities, who was uncooperative and had made furtive movements, requiring detention for officer safety. It was the familiar language, the language that had quietly justified 1,000 stops before his. He was betting, as such officers always bet, that his account in a report would outweigh the word of the man he'd cuffed. But this time, the report had to survive his own body camera, and it did not. The footage showed Elias Warner calm and courteous from the first word, offering his identification 3 times, telling the officer plainly who he was and where he worked, with the Senate pin visible on his lapel the entire time. There were no furtive movements. There was no loitering. There was a man drinking coffee on his way to work. The gap between what Hoffman wrote and what his own camera showed did not just sink the incident. It branded him a man who would put a lie in an official report, which follows an officer for the rest of his life. In the interview room, when investigators played him the footage, Hoffman tried at first to hold the line. Suspicious behavior, officer safety, a rapidly evolving situation. Then the video reached the part where he pulled a leather ID case halfway out of the senator's jacket and shoved it back without reading it, with a gold Senate pin glinting on the lapel an inch from his hand. And the investigator paused it there and asked a single quiet question. "What did you think that pin was?" Hoffman had no answer. The honest answer was that he hadn't thought about it at all, hadn't let himself see it, because he'd decided who the man was before he ever stepped out of his cruiser, and nothing the man wore or said or offered was ever going to be allowed to change it. He couldn't say that out loud. The silence in the room said it for him, and the pattern did not stay buried. Xavier Bell, once his senator had said his name out loud on that sidewalk, gave a full statement about his own stop the week before. Others came forward too, once the department was finally forced to look. A small pile of complaints against Hoffman for stops that followed the same shape. Black men and women near the Capitol asked what business they had being there, each one justified in a report with the same elastic language, each one producing nothing. And, as with every case like this, those reports had not written and approved themselves. Each had crossed a supervisor's desk and been signed off without a second glance. The vague language about suspicious behavior and loitering near federal facilities, doing exactly the work it was designed to do, making a bad stop read as a lawful one to anyone not inclined to look closely. Hoffman's habit had survived 2 years, not because it was hidden, but because the machinery around him had never once been curious about it. It took a senator, a rolling camera, and a national firestorm to make the department finally read what had been sitting in its own files all along. Lined up together next to a video of him handcuffing a senator, they told a single story. Hoffman's habit had not created itself the morning he stopped Warner. It had simply at last been caught. The findings were not survivable: unlawful detention, failure to verify obvious identification, a false official report, a documented pattern. Officer Tyler Hoffman was terminated. There was a civil rights claim that the city, staring at footage the whole world had already seen, settled rather than take before a jury. Warner did not need the money and made a point of it. He directed the settlement to organizations that provided legal help to people stopped exactly as he'd been. The ones with no PIN, no ID that would be believed, no Capitol officer to vouch for them, whose only record of what happened to them was their own unheard word. It was, he said, the only part of the personal side of the matter that interested him. The money moving from one account to another changed nothing. What he cared about was the next person on the next sidewalk having a lawyer and a record and a chance, the things he'd been fortunate enough to carry in his own jacket pocket, and most people weren't. At 30, 2 years into a career he'd spent deciding who belonged on the sidewalks of the powerful, he was finished wearing a badge, and because the firing was for cause and captured on video, no other department was going to touch him. His union, which would have fought a routine complaint to the wall, took one look at the footage and the national firestorm and declined to spend its capital defending the officer who had handcuffed a senator on camera. His last walk out of the building was a quiet one. The colleagues who'd traded jokes with him found things to look at on their screens. He had wanted to matter on the sidewalks of the powerful. He would be remembered instead as the answer to a grim trivia question, the officer who arrested a United States senator for walking to work, and no version of that story had a place for him back in a uniform. But Elias Warner was not, in the end, a man who measured justice by what happened to one officer. He had spent his whole career believing that the point of power was not to settle personal scores, but to change the rules that produced the injury in the first place. And so, he did the thing that made his response different from almost any other in these stories. He did not just accept the settlement and the firing and move on. He took his own handcuffing, the video, the pattern, the whole ugly morning, into the one room where he had more power than almost anyone alive, a committee hearing. He held hearings on racial profiling and policing, and on the federal grants that funded departments with patterns exactly like Hoffman's. And he used his seat on appropriations to attach real conditions to that money: data collection, transparency, consequences for departments that couldn't show they were policing everyone the same way. It was not a revolution, and Warner never pretended it was. Bills get watered down, oversight gets underfunded, the machinery grinds slow. But conditions attached to federal money have a way of getting a department's attention when nothing else does, precisely because the money is real. Chiefs who had shrugged off complaints for years found themselves suddenly interested in the data on their own stops because the grants depended on it. It was the least dramatic kind of change, a reporting requirement, a line in an appropriations bill, and also the kind that actually outlasts a news cycle. Warner had learned, across 2 terms, that the durable victories almost never looked like victories. They looked like paperwork. He was very good at paperwork. He sat, calm and gap-toothed and relentless, and questioned police chiefs and DOJ officials for hours, and when one of them suggested his own incident had been an isolated overreaction, he simply played the video of himself in handcuffs and asked the man to explain which part had been an overreaction. The room went very quiet. The clip played on the screens on either side of the dais. The fence, the coffee on the concrete, the officer's hand an inch from the pin, and Warner let it run to the end before he spoke again, in the mild, unhurried voice that had unnerved witnesses for 2 decades. "I want you to understand that I am the easy case," he said. "I had a PIN and an ID and a Capitol officer who knew my face and 100 cameras. I got my apology in my hearing. My question to you is not about me. My question is about every person your grantee department stop who has none of those things, and whose word ends up meaning nothing against a report. What is your data on them? Because if you don't have it, then you are asking the American taxpayer to fund a thing you have decided not to measure. The official had no answer, and the silence that followed did more work than any speech. His morning on the sidewalk had cost one officer a badge. What Warner did with it afterward reached a great deal further than that. And there were people who came out of that morning having done the right thing, which was worth marking because the difference between them and Hoffman was the whole point. Officer Reyes had crossed a street at a run to name what she was seeing out loud in front of everyone, when it would have been easier to assume her colleague knew what he was doing. Sergeant Nolan had recognized the disaster and unlocked the cuffs himself without a flicker of the instinct to protect his own officer. Even the tourists, strangers who owed Warner nothing, had refused to just walk past and had kept their phones up. None of them were crusaders. They were simply willing, in the crucial second, to see what was actually in front of them instead of the story the uniform expected. That willingness was the entire thing Hoffman had lacked. Those who had known Elias Warner a long time were not surprised by the calm or by what he did with the anger underneath it, because they knew where both came from. He had grown up the son of a school custodian in a family where his father came home every night smelling of floor wax and disinfectant, and never once complained about being looked through by the very people whose children's classrooms he kept clean. Elias had watched his father be treated as invisible for 40 years, polite, dignified, unseen, and had decided, young, two things at once: that he would become a man no one could look through, and that he would never, ever forget what it felt like to be the man being overlooked. He had run track to pay for college, the first in his family to go, and he had kept running his whole life, which was why, at 58, he still walked to work with the light frame of an athlete and the stubborn habit of an ordinary man. The morning on the sidewalk had not shocked him. That was the quietly devastating part. A United States senator, 2 blocks from the Capitol, with a pin on his lapel, had known before he ever spoke to Officer Hoffman roughly how it might go, and had braced for it because 2 Senate terms and a seat on Appropriations had not bought him out of it. His own staff had begged him more than once to take a car, to accept a security detail, to stop giving the world a chance. He had always refused, and after that morning, he refused again, more stubbornly than ever, because he had decided that the day he let one bad officer chase him off a public sidewalk was the day the officer won. What he thought about afterward was not really Hoffman. Hoffman was a problem the system would now handle, and Warner had bigger machinery to point at the real problem. What he thought about was his father, coming home smelling of floor wax, invisible to the end. And he thought about Xavier Bell, 23 years old, swallowing his own stop in silence a week before because he didn't think anyone would care. That was the thought that stayed with him. Not the indignity done to a senator who had every tool in the world to answer it. The indignity done, every single day, to the people who had none. There was one thread from that morning that mattered to Elias Warner more than the hearings or the headlines, and it was the young man who'd stood across the street with his phone up. Xavier Bell had swallowed his own stop in silence, the way he'd been swallowing things, until the morning he watched the senator he worked for get handcuffed on a sidewalk and heard the senator say his name into the record as if it counted. He gave his statement, and something in him changed after that. The specific change that happens when a person discovers that speaking up doesn't have to mean painting a target on your own back, that it can, sometimes, mean being seen. Warner did not let the moment pass. He'd known Xavier as one of a dozen bright interns. Now he knew him as the young man who'd had the presence of mind and the courage to record an injustice against his own boss. He took him under his wing in earnest, mentored him, moved him from intern to full-time legislative staff, and told him the truth about his own path, the custodian father, the being looked through, the decision to become someone who couldn't be. He told Xavier that the country desperately needed people in these rooms who knew, from the inside, what it felt like to be stopped for existing, because those were the people least likely to ever write the elastic sentence in the report, and most likely to change the rules that let it be written. A couple of years later, not much about Elias Warner's mornings had changed, and that was the point. He still walked to work, alone, 2 blocks, coffee in hand, pin on his lapel, because he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take the ordinary from him. Tyler Hoffman was gone from law enforcement for good, a name in a training file and a cautionary clip shown to recruits. Instructors would freeze the video on the frame of his hand near the Senate pin and ask the room the same question every time: how many chances did this officer have to simply look? And the answer was always the same: all of them. He'd had all of them: the ID, the pin, the offered explanation, the Capitol officer, the man's own calm insistence. And he'd taken none, because taking even one would have meant admitting that the story he'd written before he left his cruiser might be wrong. The lesson the recruits were meant to draw was not complicated, and it was not really about senators. It was that the assumptions you make about who belongs are not a shortcut to good policing. Sometimes they are the whole crime. And Xavier Bell had traded his intern's badge for a staffer's, working on the very policing reform legislation that had grown out of the morning he'd filmed, helping to write, at 25, the rules meant to protect the next young man stopped on a sidewalk for the crime of walking while black. It was not lost on Xavier, or on anyone who knew the story, that the legislation had grown directly out of the 2 stops, the senator's and his own, on the same block by the same officer, a week apart. The difference between them was only that one of the 2 men had the power to turn a humiliation into a law, and had decided to use it on behalf of the one who didn't. Xavier thought about that a great deal in the quiet moments at his new desk. He thought about how close his own stop had come to simply vanishing, one more swallowed thing, and about how the whole chain of consequence had turned on a senator, choosing to say a nobody intern's name into the record. He intended for the rest of his career to be the kind of person who said the names. He kept, on his desk, a small frame photo of the day the senator had sworn him onto the committee staff. And when the newer interns asked about it, he told them the whole story, handcuffs and all, because he thought they should know exactly what the work was for. And that's the thing to carry out of this one. Not a single second of what happened on that sidewalk had to happen. All Officer Hoffman had to do, at any point, was look at the ID offered to him 3 times, at the Senate pin an inch from his own hand, at the calm, courteous man telling him plainly who he was. 10 seconds of looking, instead of assuming, would have ended it before it began. A running jacket instead of a suit. A black man drinking coffee near the Capitol who must be loitering instead of the senator who was simply walking to work. That was all the evidence he needed to handcuff one of the 100 most powerful legislators in the country against a fence. Here's the truth underneath it. Elias Warner didn't deserve to be believed because he turned out to be a senator. He deserved it because he was telling the truth, and because the burden should never have been on him to prove he had a right to stand on a public sidewalk. He got his justice and his hearings and his reforms because he happened to be one of the few people alive with the power to answer a bad stop with the full weight of the federal government. Strip that away, and he's just a man in a running jacket whose word means nothing against a badge, which is exactly where his own young staffer stood a week earlier, and where most people stand every day. That was the arithmetic Warner kept coming back to. He had walked away from that fence with his dignity, a settlement, a set of hearings, and a change in federal law. Xavier Bell, stopped on the same block by the same officer 7 days earlier, had walked away with nothing but a hot face and a story he was afraid to tell. The only difference between the 2 mornings was who the man happened to be. And most people, on most sidewalks, are the second man, not the first. The one with no pin, no committee, no camera the officer can't turn off. Which is precisely why the pin, the committee, and the camera should never have had to matter in the first place. So, let me ask you honestly, because I read every comment. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be, sized up and moved along before you said a single word? And be honest with yourself for a moment. How often do we glance at a stranger and quietly decide whether they belong? Tell me below. That conversation is the whole reason a story like this matters. If this one moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.